good to have you here with us today, Harold. How are you doing?
Fine, thank you very much.
Excellent. So I just wanted to start with the bare basics. Where were you born?
I was born in Augusta, Georgia,
Augusta, Georgia.
home of the Masters golf team.
Ooh, home of the Masters.
Yeah.
Were you ever interested in golf?
My daddy didn't encourage it, but I did. The only high school in town at the time was a land grant high school, and it had mandatory ROTC. And so I went to 3 of the Masters because they would allow the cadets to hold the ropes at the Masters in the 50s.
Hmm.
So that was my golf experience.
But you were there at the event.
Yeah.
So when did you discover that you had a mechanical aptitude? Taking apart things, or was there a...
I probably in the early teens, maybe a little earlier, I was building a lot of models, and they were not flying models, they were what's called solid models, that you just cut up blocks of wood and made an airplane, but you had plans to do it with and all. And so I was very interested in that, and I've always enjoyed that kind of thing. And then my brother was in the Korean War, and he sent me a boat, and a model boat that had an electric motor in it and all the instructions were in Japanese. So, but I put that together, and not a state fair, but a county fair, I won first prize for that boat. So
Wow. Okay, so that's the beginning of...
that's what got me started, yeah.
Great. So with that experience, you graduate high school and go off to college, and where do you go?
I go to the University of South Carolina in 1955 and graduated in 1959.
And you studied...
Mechanical engineering.
Mechanical engineering. And yeah, that seems to be the foundation degree of all the other civil engineering or even biomedical engineering. That it's good to have a background in.
Right.
So tell us about how you got your first position in the aerospace industry.
Well, what happened is Sputnik went up in '57.
Yeah.
And I was a junior in college. And the world was very excited about that. So that piqued my interest. And then NASA was formed out of an older agency called National Advisory Committee of Aeronautics.
And that was NACA, right?
Yeah, that was NACA. And Eisenhower combined those facilities and created some new ones in October of '58. And I graduated in June of '59, so it was obviously a very interesting place to go to work.
Okay, and your first place you worked at was it the Langley?
Yeah, Langley Research Center.
And that's in Virginia?
Hampton, Virginia.
Hampton, Virginia.
And it's been there all the way back to the Wright brothers as a government facility.
And you mentioned to me earlier the Wright brothers were on
They were on the committee.
the committee for NACA. I did not know that bit of trivia. That's fascinating. So tell us a little bit about your journey through the industry. So you start at Langley, and what are you doing there in your first?
Well, it was a very interesting job. It had nothing to do with space. But Langley Research Center had multiple divisions specialized in various things or technologies. And I just happened to go to work in what was called the hydrodynamics division. And at that time, hydrofoils were a new technology, and they were interested. We were doing research on that, and research nothing but in Langley was, first off, every engineer had 3 technicians that he could use. And so you would design the test, design the vehicle you're going to test, and then instrument it, and then test it all in one place. Never had to leave the building.
Even the manufacturing of the
Most of it was models.
models. Okay.
And so it was a fascinating place to work, and it gave me a good background. But then, when the Manned Spacecraft Center, which was a spinoff from Langley, and they were going to do the real space work, whereas I was just doing some very interesting work, but I figured the space was more interesting. So I joined them in October of '61, and they moved. That was a group of people at Langley, and they moved us all to Houston. And by '62, we were here working. And the original facilities were various facilities throughout Houston that the government rented. And most of the stuff at that time was just analyzing and planning, that kind of stuff.
So when you came to Houston in the early '60s, did you move directly to Friendswood or
No,
somewhere?
I came in March of '62, and I moved into my house in March of '63,
Ah.
and I'm still in it.
Well, congratulations, long-time resident. So, did you have any colleagues living in this area with you at the time?
A large percentage of my graduating class in '59 went to Langley, and most of them went to the Manned Spacecraft Center, and most of them came to Houston. And there was at least 5 or 6 of my classmates that all moved to Friendswood.
Wow. So that is sort of the beginning of the, I guess, change in the local culture. We have some new influences.
Well, I remember a sign, and I never really researched it, but it said Friendswood, 800 people. I got a feeling that was the 1960 census.
Wow.
And in '63, the town at least doubled.
Mm.
And with a totally different culture of people.
Mm. So, so you went from Langley to the Manned Spacecraft Program, the Spacecraft Center, which would be JSC later, right? And what was your experience like there?
Well, it was exciting times. You had to figure out, one person didn't figure it all out, but there was so many issues that had to be settled so that you could then decide what the design would be and who would do it, and that kind of thing.
So did you have to use your discretion to figure out which projects to do first if you have all of these issues that need troubleshooting? Or
Well, the issue at the time, and it would have been '61, is just how you even going to do this.
yeah.
And there was the Huntsville people, which was von Braun, which you probably know. After World War II, we got a bunch of Germans that were called paperclip Germans.
Yes, sir. Operation Paperclip.
Yeah. And von Braun had worked on the V2, and he became essentially our rocket expert in the United States. And he wanted to build a giant rocket and go straight to the moon. And another guy by the name of John Hobart came up with what's called lunar orbit rendezvous. And that, you had to decide between the two because it was totally different. That if you do lunar orbit rendezvous, which turned out to be a tremendous amount of energy savings, but you had to learn how to fly in space, you had to learn how to dock, you had to learn how to land a vehicle that had no atmosphere, no wings. And, so that then drove, when they made that decision, then you knew what pieces might take to do the job. And that's when you started all these multi-stages on the rockets. And we in Houston never worked on any of the rockets. But our job was the elements of the Apollo program, which turned out to be the service module, the command module, and the lunar module.
Okay.
And the service module is, the best way to describe it is just what it says. It provided power, oxygen, everything to the overall system.
Oh.
And command module was where the men were. And then the lunar module is where the men went into to separate to land on the moon. And then separate again to come back to lunar orbit, and then use dock with the top part of the limb, and then use the service module to break you back out on lunar orbit and head you back to the Earth.
Okay.
So that, you had to have the basics. You didn't know how you were going to do it, but you had to have the fundamental requirements, I'll call it. And so I worked essentially on the command module and the lunar module. I never did any work on the service module.
Interesting. And is this the gig where you start working on lunar landing and docking systems?
Yeah,
So that's what you're referring
and
to?
water landing as well. The command module lands underneath parachutes. And so you just come down at a certain speed and you land in the water. And so my hydrodynamic experience at Langley was helpful for that.
Interesting. So while you were at the Manned Spacecraft Center, what was one of the most satisfying challenges?
Well, the whole issue on the lunar landing was what was the surface we were landing on. And there was two leading soil mechanics professors with opposite opinions. One said that it's going to be like beach sand, and the other one said it's going to be like talcum powder, and you're just going to sink out of sight. So, since I was working on the lunar landing gear, one of the issues, well, how big do you make the foot pad? And so I served on a committee that every time a Surveyor spacecraft landed on the moon, and it was developed by the Jet Propulsion Laboratories, which is part of NASA. But it was an unmanned landing on the moon. And so I was there to try to learn anything I could about the effects on the landing gear. But the most interesting and memorable part of that whole thing was the Surveyor landed on the moon. The first picture they took of the foot pad, and it's sitting right on the surface, maybe about a half an inch depression. And both of those professors jumped up and said they were right.
They're going to take the credit,
Yeah.
even though they didn't know what they were talking about.
And to carry that a little bit farther, I came back and briefed the head of the Apollo program about it. And I told him about that, and he says, I tell you what, he says, you just go figure out what the bearing pressure of a man on the moon is in a spacesuit in the backpack in the 6th gravity. And whatever that bearing pressure is, the president said we're going to walk on the moon, so we're going to land on the moon with those requirements.
Wow. So after you worked for what would become JSC, where did you go?
Well, I was there for 27 and a half years.
Wow.
And I wound up doing multiple functions after the landing on Apollo. I went to kind of an advanced program office with planning for future projects. And then at the end of my career, I was on the space station and figuring out what the management concept was going to be and how we were going to involve all of our centers to do the job.
Okay, so you started, it seems, with very detail-oriented engineering work, and at the end of your career, you're looking at the big picture and
Planning, yeah.
the planning and the direction of the program.
Yeah.
That's a good trajectory. So, what sort of qualities does one need to work in your field as an aerospace engineer?
Well, we had all disciplines. We had physics majors, we had math majors, we had civil engineers, electrical engineers, mechanical engineers. And for me, mechanical engineering was a jack of all trades. And that you could go into many different disciplines like heat transfer or thermodynamics or just gear design, whatever. And so my proof that it's kind of a jack of all trades is that a large portion of my graduating class in 1959 at South Carolina went to Langley, went to NASA. Most of them came here. None of us ever worked on the same thing.
Wow. So you're always learning something new as you're going from project to project within the company. So the Apollo missions happened, and then fast forward a little bit to the early 70s in Friendswood. What was it like in Friendswood as you were here in the early 70s once the Apollo missions made an impact?
Well, what my wife says, and I agree, that Texans have a real pioneering spirit. And so it gets into all of us.
Yeah.
And so Friendswood was really changing significantly. And it had to, I mean, the mayor at one time was looking for volunteers. We'd go out and fix potholes on Saturday. And the community would do it.
Wow.
And then we did, when the charter was written, a large portion of the people that wrote the charter were NASA employees.
So it's now sort of etched into our DNA as a city.
Well, I think it's just good planning again. Let's back up just a little bit, some period from, say, 63 to 69.
Okay.
Who was living here?
Yeah.
And who were these NASA people? There was three main subdivisions that started in that era. It was Imperial Estates, which is where I live, Imperial Gardens, and Imperial Chateau. And they were all land that belonged to Browns. And some of his sons and grandsons, whoever they were selling the property for the development. But in my neighborhood, Chris Kraft was there. His job at Langley in the late 40s, he was doing flight tests with not models but real airplanes with pilots in them. And the name of the game was, what kind of data do we need to get while they're flying, and how do we have communications with them, Okay, that just got amplified when you go to a lunar orbit rendezvous. You got spacecraft going around the Earth and then going around the moon. And he developed the whole concept of how to do that with mission control and the flight directors. And he led and developed all of that.
The whole schema for mission control. Wow. Okay. And he was in your neighborhood.
Yeah.
Did y'all have dinner together?
No. He was a member of the Episcopal Church, by the way. That's the other thing I was going to bring in. Second, and then Deke Slayton, who was one of the Mercury 7, lived in my neighborhood. George Lowell, who was head of the Apollo program, lived in Imperial Chateau, which later was Dick Conway's house. It's been torn down after the flood. Then there was some the significant groups of people that came in. It was not only the NASA people, but in that same era, the F-111 was in trouble at GD Fort Worth, General Dynamics Fort Worth, and a bunch of those came down. One of those was George Struhall, who was on the library board.
Yeah.
Another interesting story is there was at least 4 Canadians living here, and how they got into the program was that they were working on an airplane called the Arrow in Canada, and whatever they call the head of, not the president, but
The Prime Minister?
Prime Minister,
Yeah.
canceled the program. And it was a very advanced aircraft. And as it turned out, that same aircraft company with some of its personnel had had an argument with back at the Langley Research Center. And all Langley Research Center reports always wound up with some sort of conclusion.
Yeah.
Canadians didn't agree with it. They came down and argued about it, and they convinced NASA that they were wrong. So they had a good relationship way before the Apollo program. So when the airplane company was shut down, they sent resumes to the head of the center, where we had worked with some of them, and we hired 70 Canadians at that time. And there was at least 4 of those here in Friendswood.
Wow.
So, you know, we had, it's not only a few people from Langley that really did basic research. We needed people that knew about the man-machine interface. You had to invent the way you were going to do the communication, what data you're going to need, and so forth. And then make it Canadians, General Dynamics for work, which was mostly Oklahoma and Texas people. We had a few people from Convair in San Diego. They were all here. So some people say the aerospace industry is just a big country club, but they do have common grounds, and a lot of them came here, but we all had different experiences, and it was significant. The combination of all of that.
Oh. And so you were employed by the Manned Spacecraft Center during Apollo 11, correct?
No. Manned Spacecraft Center started, it was really out of Langley. There was a space task group.
Okay.
And it actually started about 2 years before I went to work.
I see.
And I actually was hired as backfill to some of the people that they had lost that had gone to the space task group. And then I got good experience in what I was doing, but then it looked like that was really the place to be. So I joined it in '61.
Wow.
And it became the Manned Spacecraft Center.
Okay, and that became the Manned Spacecraft Center.
Which then we had to hire all these people. We've got the Canadians and General Dynamics and Convair and everybody else in here.
So during, let me see, give me one moment. So what was the environment like in Friendswood during the Apollo missions? I mean, were your neighbors and were people pretty enthused? Do you remember any instances?
Oh yeah, and the real issue, and if you talk to my wife, but even at the thing we had here, with celebrating the 50th anniversary, all the wives complained that we were gone all the time. And that's true. I would go 30 days out to Jet Propulsion Laboratories when the surveyors flew or landed. And manufacturers from North American, it's called then, was on the west coast, and Grumman was the lunar module, and they were on the east coast. And then you had the time zone difference, you were in the middle, so you have early morning calls and late afternoon calls.
How did they cope with that, with y'all being gone so much?
It did some damage to some families.
Sure.
But it had to. It was required, but everybody couldn't handle it.
Sure. So I'm gonna ask I guess a big picture question, and then I'm going to ask a question about your own personal research. But for now, where would you like to see the U.S. space program go, and what can we still contribute to the space race?
The government is going to have to fund space.
Yeah.
And the question is how much can they fund? But the other interesting thing that's happening is that the private industry is picking up a lot of things.
Yeah.
And they are not burdened with, we called it Design, Development, Test, and Engineering, or DDT&E.
Mm-hmm.
And you went through the whole cycle. You designed it on paper, then you built it, then you tested it, and then you evaluated it. They kind of just build it and see what it does.
See what happens, and
It saves a lot of money.
And I guess we're thinking of like SpaceX and Elon Musk.
Right.
Wow. So do you think that's a serviceable model for the future, this sort of public-private?
Well, the thing that
Collaboration.
just amazes me at what he has done, everybody's impressed with the rocket itself, but he lands that rocket, and I was in the landing business. And before we really did Lunar Orbiter Rendezvous, we were looking at direct ascent to the moon, and it would have required a very tall structure
Yeah.
and not much wheelbase, and I didn't think it was ever going to work. And he has landed those things. In fact, I think recently he found 3 in 2 or 3 days and landed all of them.
It's a pretty good track record thus far.
Yeah, he's done very well.
And
So it needs to be a merge between the two, is all I'm saying. Somehow or another, we got to put it all together. But putting a man on top of one of those rockets, you really need to be a little careful. He's even done that.
so what kind of research do you follow these days in regard to space exploration? Do you like to read about current events or developments, or?
It turns out that one of my jobs after Apollo was called systems engineering. And that is more looking at the big picture, as you said earlier. And so you get into all kind of things of, what could you do? So I'm more interested in, are they going to develop the batteries good enough to get us 300 miles or 700 miles or what have you? How are we going to save energy? How are we going to quit polluting and that kind of thing? I'm more interested in all of those aspects. Where are we going to get our power?
Hmm.
And this country's got 400 years of coal.
Yeah.
And coal is turned into a bad actor. Nuclear is turned into a bad actor. And natural gas is got the CO2. But
Well,
you need a whole system for things to go together.
even batteries, that's certain waste you have to figure out what to do with.
Right.
Solar energy doesn't seem to generate enough energy to
Well,
fuel what we
anything
need.
solar or wind needs storage, which
Yeah.
is the battery.
So there are still a lot of challenges, but I have faith.
Yeah, so do I. But I'm always, when I read the business section or whatever, I'm always looking for those little caveats of what's going on.
Great. And what bit of advice would you give someone who's in high school who wants to work in the field that you worked in? What bit of advice would you give them?
Well, they need, in high school, they need to start taking, they got a name for it now, but the technical courses.
The STEM classes?
STEM class, yes. But, math is really number one.
Yeah.
And you got to really like your numbers. But any field allows you to do things, and my personal experience was that mechanical engineer was the best for me.
Mm.
But we have specialists. There's a guy here that lives in Friendswood and worked at NASA. He was a microwave expert.
Mm.
And he's the nation's leading microwave expert. And so, that's just another field. And mechanical engineering never would do that. So.
Microwave expert. So if it can microwave a potato in 5 minutes, it can go to space. Okay.
Well, no, the whole issue there is that you can transmit energy over distance.
Yeah.
And I'm not even sure how he became a microwave expert and what he was doing, but I know that one of the projects I worked on in the mid-70s was really way out, where you would actually generate power in space and beam the energy through microwaves to Earth.
Wow.
And it can be done.
Just makes me think of all the technology we've inherited from the manned space program.
One other thing we ought to point out is
Yeah.
that after we landed on the moon and the Friendswood Charter was developed, the majority of people that were on the committee that wrote the charter were NASA employees.
Hmm.
So that's what we contributed to Friendswood.
Contributed a vibrant culture here, a lot of brain power, and
Good school system.
good schools. May the legacy live on.
Yeah,
Well, thank you so much, Harold, for being here.
you're welcome.